The fire alarm was called into the local 911 service at 8:07 p.m. One of the neighbors, who noticed the fire, called, repeating, "The house is on fire. It's Vicky's house, hurry. I hear something cracking inside." When the fire in Vicki Friedli's house died down, the bodies of 2 adults and a separate, especially strange body of a young girl were found. Moreover, the body of the young girl was pulled outside the house and set on fire separately. Investigators who arrived at the scene were stunned by what they saw, but they immediately noticed strange details. There was more than one source of fire. Moreover, traces of spilled fuel were found on the floor. This was an intentional arson, carried out in such a way that the fire would destroy everything: evidence, traces, and the victims themselves. But why? And who could do something like this? So horrifying to all the neighbors, firefighters, and investigators. Dear viewers, in the next video releases, you will find very intriguing and confusing cases. And in order not to miss them, be sure to subscribe to the channel and please like the video. When Vicki Friedli moved to the Ruby Down Mountain Hills in Riverside County, California, she was looking for peace. After turbulent years when her life resembled a TV series with a series of ups and downs, Vicki decided it was time for simplicity. At 53, Vicki has been through a lot. Her youth fell in the late 70s and 80s, an era when the American province was drowning in ambitions and disappointments. She grew up in Oklahoma, married early, divorced early, and raised her daughter, Becky, alone. Motherhood became Vicki's main mission. She was one of those women who do not complain about fatigue, do not show pain, do not quit working even on the hardest days. One thing was important to her: to give her daughter a chance at a better life. She never asked for help, even when she was left without money or support. Vicki believed that work and patience will put everything in its place over time. The house in the hills seemed like a new beginning to her, modest but honest. There she could breathe freely, drink her morning coffee with a view of the mountains, and finally stop looking back. She dreamed that it was here that her daughter would begin her adult life, full of hopes, not fears. Becky Friedli, Vicki's only daughter, was her complete opposite and at the same time, a reflection. Brave, sometimes stubborn, sometimes too naive. She grew up with the conviction that everything in life is possible if you try. As a teenager, Becky was active, participated in school projects, dreamed of becoming a veterinarian or a biologist, adored animals, and often took home stray cats. But with the beginning of high school, changes began in her life. A new company, a little rebellion, searching for herself. Nevertheless, the connection with her mother remained strong. They often quarreled, but always made up. They had their own special line of trust that no one could cross. At the same time, John Hayward appeared in Vicki's life, a man of about 55, a former soldier. He was not rich, but he was honest, reliable, and most importantly, he treated Vicki with respect. He did not strive to become Becky's father, but he always treated her with politeness. Vicki appreciated his calm and care. Together, they arranged a life that seemed quite ordinary, almost ideal by the standards of a small town. He was what is called a safe haven. But often, when it seems that everything is finally getting better, something sinister accumulates under the surface. Their newfound calm turned out to be deceptive. Becky also recently began dating a young man named Alexander Carlson. He was several years older than her, charismatic, self-confident, and at first seemed quite harmless to Vicki. Alexander quickly entered the family circle. He helped with the housework, stayed for dinners, brought Vicki flowers. The relationship was complicated. He seemed charming, but he had a strong desire to control. In a correspondence with a friend, Becky once wrote the phrase, "Sometimes I'm scared. They say strange things, but I don't want to seem weak." These words, as it turned out later, would become an eerie omen. September 9th, 2006, began as an ordinary day. Nothing foreshadowed trouble. Vicki was at home. John Hayward was doing chores. Becky was getting ready to meet friends that evening. She was last seen on her way home, stopping at the store for a soda. A surveillance camera captured her at 7:13 p.m. She was never seen again. The hot day, as often happens in Southern California, gave way to coolness, but even a light breeze did not foreshadow tragedy. That evening, a house was burning on the outskirts of a small town. The fire broke out quickly and almost immediately turned into an open fire, engulfing almost the entire building in less than 10 minutes. The local 911 service received a call about the fire at 8:07 p.m. The first to hear the call were dispatchers from the Riverside County Fire Department. One of the neighbors who noticed the fire called, repeating, "The house is on fire. It's Vicky's house. Hurry. I hear something cracking inside." When the firefighters arrived, they saw a wall of fire rising above the roof like an erupting volcano. Flames were shooting out of the windows, as if trying to get out, destroying everything in their path. At first glance, it might have seemed that a gas leak or faulty wiring was the cause of the fire, but it soon became clear that something was wrong. The fire started almost instantly. The flames spread throughout the house with such speed that it could not have been an accident. The neighbors did not hear screams, gunshots, or the noise of a struggle. Only a sudden dull bang and a fiery glow. To this day, no one can say exactly at what point that night the nightmare began. But one thing is clear. Everything was planned in advance. From the street, you could already smell the acrid smell of gasoline, uncharacteristic of a normal fire. The neighbors stood on the side of the road in panic. Some were crying. Some were filming what was happening on their phones. Vicki Friedli's house was ablaze like a torch, and it seemed like there was nothing left inside. Even the walls, built from fireproof materials, couldn't withstand the heat. The temperature inside the house was off the charts. The fire was bright and dense, as if someone had splashed fuel into all the rooms. Firefighters fought the fire for more than 40 minutes until they managed to get inside. The walls were charred, the ceiling had partially collapsed, the furniture had turned into a molten mass. But there was still something worse than fire inside. According to one of the first employees to arrive, the flames were too intense for a typical household fire. The house burned quickly, too quickly for a typical fire. And this was no accident. The arson was organized in 3 zones: at the entrance, in the kitchen, and in the bedroom. The surrounding grass remained untouched, as if the fire had bypassed the territory along predetermined boundaries. At the back of the property, the investigators found footprints, 3 different types, 2 of which did not belong to the residents. This means there were at least 2 criminals. Under the windows, they found the remains of gloves, charred, but retaining the chemical composition of the synthetic fiber. Someone was wearing latex or nitrile gloves. This indicated that the criminals were trying not to leave DNA. One of the switches in the house was unscrewed by hand, as if someone wanted to create the illusion of a short circuit before setting the fire. Even the way the smoke spread told the firefighters that the fire was unnatural. Too evenly. Too quickly. The criminals did not come just like that. They came to put an end to it. One of the criminals knew the layout of the rooms in the house, as if he had been here many times. They entered the house not as uninvited guests, but as those who were expected, and this makes it even scarier. Most likely, Vicki or Becky herself opened the door for them, perhaps with surprise, but without alarm. Not a single lock was broken. Not a single window was smashed. It was our own people inside. Traces of fuel were even found near the switches, indicating thoughtfulness. But as often happens in such cases, the criminals overestimated the fire. It did not destroy everything. This was a crime committed with such a degree of overwhelming horror that it could not be explained by banal malice. There was something more here, an idea, a symbol, a personal war with those who, in the criminal's opinion, betrayed. Once the fire was localized, a primary inspection began inside the building. The first thing that caught the eye was not the chaos, but the strange order of the burnt areas. Some areas were burned clean, as if the arsonists knew exactly where to burn everything to the end, and others, on the contrary, remained partially intact, as if they were deliberately avoided. This created the impression that the criminals were not simply trying to destroy evidence, but to place accents. A metal knife with a melted plastic handle was found on the kitchen stove. Its position seemed strange. The blade was not in the work area, but lay on the floor, almost at an angle to the back door, as if it had been thrown in a hurry. The wall by the stairs was covered in soot, but underneath it were the outlines of hands, traces of an attempt to rise or defend themselves. In the corner of the living room, where the furniture had once stood, only a fragment of a metal frame and one broken frame with part of a photograph remained. When the image was partially restored, it was of Becky, with her mother on her graduation day. This photo, accidentally surviving the fire, became a silent testimony. There was more than just family here. There was love. What began as an accidental fire now revealed a much darker reality. The experts expected to see traces of an accidental tragedy, but what they found exceeded their worst expectations. This was the turning point. When the fire in Vicki Friedli's house died down, the bodies of 2 adults and a separate, particularly strange body of a young girl were discovered. Moreover, the body of the young girl had been dragged outside the house and set on fire separately. It did not look like a crime in anger. It was planned. Investigators who arrived on the scene immediately noticed strange details. There was more than one source of fire. Moreover, traces of spilled fuel were found on the floor. Experts later confirmed gasoline or a similar accelerant was used. This was a deliberate arson, carried out in such a way that the fire destroyed everything: evidence, traces, and the victims themselves. But why? And who could do something like this? The bodies of 2 adults, Vicki Friedli and John Hayward, were found inside the house. They were lying in different rooms, charred but preserved enough for the pathologist to later determine that death was not caused by fire. According to the medical examiner's conclusion, both were killed before the fire was set. Blows to the head and body, signs of strangulation. It was not an accident, not a suicide. It was a murder. Brutal and deliberate. But the most horrific discovery was waiting outside the house. In the backyard, near the bushes, the officers found a 3rd body. It was naked, in an unnatural position, almost completely charred. At first, they could not even establish the identity, but later, by teeth and the remains of clothing, they identified it. It was Vicki Friedli, Vicki's 18-year-old daughter. The police began with the usual, compiling a list of potential suspects. Neighbors were questioned on the very first night. Most of them did not hear anything suspicious, with the exception of one man who claimed to have seen 2 young men near the house shortly before the fire. He could not describe them exactly, but noted that one was wearing a black t-shirt and was walking behind the second. The testimony was vague, but immediately aroused the interest of investigators. The investigation began in near darkness. The fire had destroyed most of the physical evidence. Inside the house, everything had been burned down to charred walls. Firefighters and forensic experts wore masks, breathing in the smell of burning and rotting wood. Forensic experts literally pieced together the remains of furniture, wiring, personal belongings, anything that could provide any clue. But many traces were irretrievably destroyed. They carefully combed through the debris, hoping to find at least one fragment that had not been destroyed by the flames. Every scrap of fabric, every charred object was recorded and packed as potential evidence. Photographs, dishes, jewelry, everything was either melted or charred beyond recognition. Among the debris, they found a charred chain, presumably belonging to Vicki. A barely discernible engraving remained on it. However, the key evidence could not be objects, but residual traces, microparticles, odors, unerased chemical compounds. The fires were located at the entrance, in the hallway, and in the back of the house, exactly where Becky's body was later found. The first reconstructions showed that the arsonists acted quickly, as if according to a pre-planned plan. The interior walls were treated with flammable liquid in several places. This was indicated by stains on the concrete. Also, a shadow from an object was found on one of the walls, an unburned part of the cabinet, protected by a body. Under a layer of ash in the living room, a metal button with a drop of brown plaque was found. Possible blood, later confirmed by an expert examination. The work was complicated not only by the destruction, but also by time. Every minute reduced the chances of preserving micro-evidence. The weather also made its adjustments. The rain the day before wet the backyard, washing away possible footprints. However, it was in this yard that they managed to find a partially unburned sock, later connected with Becky's clothes. This sock became one of the first material clues that allowed them to record the position of the body before the arson. Each find added a fragment to the mosaic that the investigation was literally assembling from the ashes. One of the investigators later said, "This was a fight not just against the crime, but against its erasure. We had to argue with the fire. But even in the charred ruins, the house was not silent. It spoke to those who knew how to listen." However, there were details that were saved. For example, a fragment of Vicki Friedli's phone. The equipment had been damaged by high temperatures, but the chip that stored the last messages had partially survived. After restoring the data, it became clear. In the days leading up to the murder, Vicki and her boyfriend Alexander Carlson had been in intense correspondence. Several messages were particularly disturbing. Among them, "You know what will happen if you leave. I don't want to hurt you, but you make me. They agree. It has to be done." The police immediately paid attention to "they." Was it a random phrase or something more? It soon became clear that Alexander was not alone. His closest friend, John Paul Frankel, was mentioned in the testimony as a person with an unstable psyche and a deep interest in the occult. As a teenager, he had participated in online communities that discussed power over others, mind manipulation, and even symbolic fire rituals. It all seemed like juvenile delirium, until it turned out there were 3 victims, and one of them was burned alive behind the house, separate from the others. Meanwhile, investigators began to piece together the victims' social connections. They interviewed Becky's friends, classmates, Vika's colleagues, John Hayward's former partners. Almost everyone recalled their family with warmth. However, several people independently said one important phrase. After she started dating Alexander, she changed. She increasingly said that she was afraid of losing control, that they were watching. These words acquired an eerie meaning after a possible connection was established between Carlson, Frankel, and an informal group of young people who called themselves the Liberated, an informal community with elements of cult thinking. Despite these red flags, there was no direct evidence. No blood, no DNA, no witnesses. Alexander and John both denied any involvement. They claimed they were not there on the day of the murder. Carlson provided an alibi that he was with friends. Frankel claimed he was at home. An investigation showed that there was no evidence to the contrary, but their veracity was not confirmed either. The investigation reached a dead end. Within a year, the case was officially classified as a cold case. But no one at the Riverside County Sheriff's Department was going to forget about it. The archives contained hundreds of pages of reports, dozens of hours of interrogations, and fragments of evidence that could not be deciphered. Detective Daniel Rivera once said in an interview, "We're not giving up. This is not just a murder. This is an attempt to erase an entire family. We're not going to let them do that." The years passed. But technology did not stand still. By 2015, forensic science had made great strides. A new round in the investigation began when, under a program to re-examine unsolved cases, Project Cold Truth, fragments from the crime scene were sent for reanalysis, including fragments of Becky's clothing found near her body. The lab managed to extract microparticles of DNA belonging to a man. Previously, the sample was considered uninformative. Now, technology has made it possible to establish it matches the profile of John Paul Frankel, whose data was in the database after one of the previous arrests. This was the first real breakthrough. Later, thanks to electronic data, investigators reconstructed the routes of the suspect's phones on the day of the tragedy. Signals from towers confirmed. Both phones, Carlson's and Frankel's, were in the area of Friedli's house 40 minutes before the fire and were then turned off. Later, they were turned on in another area. Such a shutdown of devices at the very moment of the murder looked extremely suspicious. The investigation was able to track their every step the day before and after the crime. Computers, diaries, printouts were seized. One of the laptops contained a folder with a frightening title, Atonement in Fire. Inside were manifestos, fragments of pseudo-philosophical texts, drawings, descriptions of purgatory, where only 3 can be brought. This was not just a crime. This was ideologically colored violence. What was especially alarming was that Carlson had searched the internet for queries related to temporary geolocation shutdown the day before the tragedy. He had also browsed forums on the use of homemade incendiary mixtures. An old notebook was also found in Frankel's house, where plans for a house similar to Friedli's were drawn. The drawing showed entrances, corridors, and especially the back door, through which, as it later turned out, Becky's body was taken out. The investigators realized that the crime had not been prepared in one day. At the same time, Carlson had bought a canister of gasoline and new clothes. He had burned the old ones the day after the fire, as witnesses confirmed. The evidence was forming a clear and gloomy picture. With each passing day, the investigation became more and more confident. This was not an accident. This was the execution of a pre-written script. A separate blow was dealt by the analysis of Frankel's hard drive, where specialists restored deleted photos. One of them was Becky, at a party, a week after meeting Carlson. Becky in the photo looked carefree, as if she did not suspect that someone had already decided her fate. After these findings, investigators decided to initiate arrests. They could not risk making a repeat mistake. These elements, DNA and mobile geolocation data, became the starting point. Investigators interrogated Carlson and Frankel again, this time with a new tactic. Carlson, under pressure, began to confuse his testimony. At first, he claimed that he was not there. Then, that he was, but only for a minute. Then, that John ruined everything. This was almost a confession. Frankel remained silent, but the evidence spoke for him. Against the backdrop of these discoveries, the district attorney's office brought formal charges. The Vicki Friedli case was no longer cold. In 2017, 11 years after the crime, the final but no less important chapter in the story of Vicki Friedli and her family began: the trial. In the years since the crime, much has changed. Witnesses have moved away, details may have blurred, memories may have faded. But the pain felt by the families and the community remained as acute. The public was waiting for one thing: justice. Alexander Carlson and John Paul Frankel were taken into custody in October 2017. The charges were serious: triple first-degree murder, arson with intent to destroy evidence, conspiracy to commit violence, and sexual assault of a minor, the last count pertaining to a separate incident involving Vicki Friedli. Prosecutors announced their intention to seek life in prison without parole. The death penalty was also discussed, but was ruled out due to the lack of a direct admission and the claims of a mitigating defense. The trial began in the spring of 2022 in a Riverside County courtroom. Interest in the case was enormous. Journalists, bloggers, activists, victims' families, and ordinary residents of the city filled the room. Cameras were not allowed, but each hearing was covered by the local news. People wanted to know, how could two young people who knew the victims do such a thing? The judge, Amy Carter, known for her strict approach and respect for procedural norms, immediately set strict limits. No speculation, no emotional outbursts. Only facts, only evidence, only the truth. The prosecutor's office built the case methodically. The main evidence was a match to John Frankel's DNA, found on the remains of Becky's clothes. By that time, this examination had already been confirmed 3 times by independent laboratories. Carlson, although he did not leave biological traces, was recorded by telephone data, which indicated his presence in the area of the Friedli house at a critical time. The recovered correspondence was also presented to the court, including Becky's disturbing messages to her friend the day before her death. "I don't know what they're trying to achieve. Sometimes I feel like they're waiting for me to break. He scares me, but I don't want to seem weak." These phrases were accompanied by screenshots of conversations with Alexander, where he wrote, "You belong to us, and if you're not with us, you'll burn alone." In the context of what happened, this sounded not like a metaphor, but like a direct threat. The prosecution claimed that this was a veiled description of the crime committed on September 9, 2006. The defense, on the contrary, tried to present what was happening as intellectual fantasies, mind games of 2 unstable young people, having nothing to do with the real crime. The lawyers argued that Frankel's DNA could have been on the clothes earlier during a meeting with Becky, and that Carlson was not in the house on the day of the tragedy, despite the phone records. They insisted there was no direct evidence and that the whole story is a theory built on speculation. However, two witnesses who had not previously testified turned out to be on the prosecution's side. One of them was Frankel's ex-girlfriend, who said that in 2007, while intoxicated, he said the phrase, "They were not innocent. We just did what was needed." The second witness was a former friend of Carlson's, with whom he, according to him, discussed the possibility of a purifying arson, saying that fear is the key. The prosecutors also presented the behavior of the accused after the murder. Both abruptly changed their social circle, moved, deleted social networks, and refused all contacts from the past. Carlson even changed his name in the profiles. All this pointed to an attempt to go into the shadows, to disappear. The trial lasted almost 2 months. Each week brought more and more details, and with each day there was a growing feeling that the prosecution was getting closer to the truth. In her final statement, prosecutor Jenna Martin said, "They didn't just kill. They tried to destroy everything. Bodies, memories, evidence, truth. But the truth does not burn. It can smolder, but one day it will flare up, like the fire that started it all. Only now. This is the flame of justice." The defense tried to appeal to the lack of video recordings, to the possibility of alternative versions, but the jury was unwavering. After 3 days of deliberations, they unanimously found Alexander Carlson and John Paul Frankel guilty on all counts. The courtroom was silent. John Hayward's mother cried, holding a photo of her son. Vicki's friend, in a black veil, squeezed her sister's hand. And Becky's relative, speaking to the press, said, "She was just a girl. She had plans, dreams. They took everything from her, but they will not take justice from her." Judge Carter, announcing the sentence, noted, "Your crime is not only cruel, but also vile. You took not only the lives of 3 people, but their futures, their families, their right to remember. You tried to erase their existence, but you couldn't. The law says you are not free, and you never will be." Both were sentenced to triple life imprisonment without parole. Since the trial, Vicki Friedli's case has become a symbol that even after years, the truth can emerge, that even in the rubble and ashes, there is still a chance to hear the victim's voice,